The following is a preview of a Patreon exclusive.
So this really is all kind of predicated on an article that it flew around the internet. I don't know, it got a bunch of traction about a year ago around this time, and it was some. I don't have the book in front of me, but it was the making of Star Wars: Return of the Jedi. So it was kind of like they pull back the curtain. There's a lot of it's a really amazing book.
Oh, I have the book.
Tons
Yeah.
and tons of behind the
That
scenes
should have been my
artwork,
show and
right?
tell.
Oh yeah, you should have brought it out. The concept art is great. Of course, most of it I think we've already seen by now. Every time you see these images, like these behind the scenes images of, Carrie Fisher and Warwick Davis and just anybody on the set of Return of the Jedi, and you see these black and white candid photos, a lot of that is being pulled directly from that making of Star Wars Return of the Jedi book. But it's got a number of things in there. One of the more interesting aspects is who is it? Oh darn it, Michael Renser.
Well,
Is that his name, Michael?
J.W. Rensler.
J.W. Renser. I don't know. He's got Michael. So and rest in peace. We lost him. I think it was last year, right?
Yeah, it was a couple of
maybe
years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah,
now?
it's been a little while.
Yeah. But when so Renser did this book, particular book, he did a really good job of capturing a lot of the dialogue that was kind of going back and forth. And specifically, there is a section in here that's called "To Kill or Not to Kill," and that section has some dialogue that's happening between Lawrence Kasdan, who we'll talk about in a little bit, because I don't know that everybody's familiar with kind of who he is and how he got kind of started with Star Wars. George Lucas, who I think we all know, and then Mark Hand, who was the director for Return of the Jedi. And it's really kind of this like creative soundboard, whiteboard, just throwing out ideas, trying to hash out some of the finer details of the outline that George Lucas had put forward. And in this conversation, they have this debate about what it means, or should they be killing characters? And you get a sense that, and this is not the only example. There are other examples that have happened during the course of writing Raiders of the Lost Ark, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, where Lucas and Kasdan were always kind of they had they had very strong opinions about how they felt about things.
Right.
For Kasdan, he felt people needed to die because it brought emotional weight to the storyline, that sort of thing. Where Lucas was more about the fairy tale, and I want to save all that because we are going to get into that here in just a little bit. But they had very different opinions about why characters should die and who should die specifically, which we'll talk about as well. And so that started off this great debate, which I call the great debate, because in Star Wars, we have a lot of characters that I personally feel just die, and for it feels like it's very inapparent in terms of the reason as to why they pass. Sometimes I'm left crying on my pillow at night because of Ben Solo. Sometimes it could be somebody that's, I could care less about. But nonetheless, there are some characters that die. And I kind of want to get into some of the reasons, because I think from a story perspective, they should have. I mean, I think we all would agree that every character should die if they, let me back up. Should they die, there is something that behind their death, right? Something that propels the story forward, propels another character, allows a character to continue to grow from that point on, et cetera, right? I don't know that always happens in Star Wars. And I think that's kind of what I want to pull back on some of these characters and just kind of talk about, do we feel like that was a worthy death? How about that?
Sounds like a plan.
So I want to ask you then.
This comes up a lot, though, in our conversations about, when we're preparing for, we do the Death Watch, right? This always comes up, at least in this very general sense, where we're not talking about it more specifically, but it keeps coming back to, well, what purpose would it serve if they were to die? And what would they, if Hunter were to die, what would that do for Omega? Does it really have as much impact now as it did back in season 1? I mean, so these types of things it kind of permeate our discussions. So it's great to have a more focused conversation about it and to get, Kasdan and Lucas's perspectives on it, I think, and get, this is a moment in time conversation, back when it was still Revenge of the Jedi. And so right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's just to give you a basis of when this conversation was happening. This was still very much early in the development process of Return of the Jedi. And so this conversation, well, the thing I like about those, that this conversation could still be brought forward into every other discussion we have. And I actually went through, and I think I tried to come up with scenarios of, these are the times I think we would see deaths, and here's maybe the situations that they seem appropriate for. And we'll get a little bit into that too as we get throughout the show.
I guess the first question is, I guess for you personally, when does it make, and then we're talking Star Wars specific here, because again, we're going to branch out just very quickly, but Star Wars specific, like what is the acceptance criteria for someone's death in Star Wars for Jonesy.
Okay, well, I'll just read out my 3 here. Okay, so number 1,
Okay.
the
Yeah.
the character's no longer useful, right? But it's weak for them just to kinda go away. There was enough of the character's presence, but there's really nothing else for them to do, right? And
Mm.
so to get them off screen, you could kill them. Now, I'm not saying that's a great I think in George Lucas's perspective, that might be lazy. I think in Lawrence Kasdan's perspective, it might be lazy, but that's one situation, right? Where we don't really care. Yeah, they were cool, but they don't really care. Now, number 2 is probably the most prevalent one that we have in Star Wars with the hero's journey, right? You have to remove the crutch from the primary protagonist because this
Mhm.
is how they make that next step, that next leap. They have to have, it's not only it's the reaction from their call to action, but it's also their natural progression. They can't have the mentor with them anymore. They have to make their own decisions, and they don't have a
Right.
choice. Now they have to, right?
Yeah.
And then another one is more like a general story aspect of it. And this one's got a couple of parts to it. One is you want to make sure that it is very clear that no one is safe. You have this general impending doom. The threat's real. Everything could fall apart. And if someone doesn't die, you don't have enough. You don't have enough realism to it to where you actually feel like you're like that there is this prevalent just risk happening all the time, right?
Mhm.
And part two of that is that you can't be afraid to give everything and then you have to keep proving it, right? So you have to basically, if you're going to give everything, you have to be afraid to lose something. And
Yeah.
I think, and again, this kind of fits more of like a Rogue One type of thing. And I think is where I usually generalize this because it's not really just one of your protagonists, it's kind of everybody. You just have everybody feels like there's no way they can get out of this, right? But in order to make any kind of gains, you have to sacrifice. And there's really, if everyone were to survive, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Because when you have a revolution, like, you and I grew up with Texas history, the Battle of the Alamo, right? And like no one survives, right? But that sets up, and these aren't just stories. This is a history, right? That sets
Yeah.
up what you have after that with the Battle of San Jacinto and things like that, right? And Goliad before all of that. So these are things that just snowball, and they give your troops something to rally around. They give your audience something to rally around in order to get that retribution or to get that final resolution that their deaths weren't in vain, but they still had to happen because the odds were just so stacked against them that for them to survive is just silly and just doesn't
Yeah.
work. So generally, those are the three, I think, buckets I came up with of why are deaths important, and when do they make some amount of sense? And I'm sure I might be missing something in there, but what did you have kind of on your radar for that?
No, I think most of my talking points, at least on that, are pretty much in line with that, right? It's there the quick and easy lazy answer is it depends, right? There are some characters that I feel like I need to have all of those things. And usually those tend to be like the main characters, right? Those are your Luke Skywalkers, your Han Solos, your Ben Solos, et cetera, et cetera. There are plenty of characters in Star Wars that are not main characters. They may be ancillary characters, tertiary characters, characters that, yeah, they had good moments, right? But so if they die, it's kind of like, oh, whatever. It's not that big of a deal. So I think it is a very nuanced answer. I think at the end of the day, we want to feel like the death was meaningful. Usually, if it's meaningful to another character, then we can empathize and sympathize with that. And so that becomes more meaningful to us. And I think that's where we get disconnected when characters kind of bite the bullet or whatever, the bolt. And there's like Lauren's saying right now, there's no stakes. There's nothing, there's no emotional weight. There's no stakes. There's no risk. I think in Star Wars too, and it's interesting. This comes up in the conversation between Lucas and Kasdan, where they're talking about, well, if everybody just dies, right, then that's the extreme, and no one cares. There's nothing really at stake, right? There's no risk involved. There's no way for people to get invested in what's going on because it's all going to just end up dying. Now, Rogue One is a very different story, and we'll talk more later on that. But I think the extreme, like you mentioned, is also, or I guess the opposite of that is what you mentioned is also true. If everybody lives and no one dies, then you never get a sense of risk. You never really get emotionally tied or connected with the characters, the storyline. The stakes aren't high, so you're just kind of watching this, you know, I don't know, superficial story with really a lot of laser bolts and flashes and special effects, and at the end of the day, you just kind of walk away. You don't think twice about it because there was nothing there to kind of pull at your heartstrings or pull at your mind in any way. So I think all of those are prevalent. And Star Wars is not. it's not unique in that they check all the boxes on these characters. There's plenty of flaws. I think we're going to expose some of those here tonight and talking about some of these characters. But I guess at the end of the day, I want to feel something for the character. I want
Right.
their death to not feel in vain. I want that. You brought up hero's journey. That is, it's a staple, right? That just has to happen. And I think in those characters, I think there's some really good examples where we have characters that go through the hero's journey. Some characters go through it multiple times, right, on smaller micro levels, and then they have this kind of overarching larger hero's journey. But that is one of the steps. That is that detachment. The mentor that comes in has to leave so that character can continue to grow.
Right.
That was all part of what Joseph Campbell was trying to explain, and it's been done many, many times in history before. So I don't know that I had anything different. I think you did a good job of kind of compartmentalizing a lot of those things. Again, it's probably more nuanced, and there's probably variations and spinoffs and that sort of thing, and we'll probably weed some of that out here in just a little bit. Now, here's the one thing I do want to say about Star Wars. Star Wars is very unique in that, and I'm going to quote Luke Skywalker in saying that no one's ever really gone. There are plenty of deaths in Star Wars where and this comes up again in the conversation between Kasdan and Lucas, because we have Force ghosts, right? That kind of takes a little bit out of it,
You have a bit of an
right?
out.
In some
Yeah.
ways, yeah, it takes a little bit out of it. So because it's like, okay, now at least from A New Hope, or with the onset of what Qui-Gon Jinn learned, any Jedi that died has the potential to kind of just still live on. Ben Solo, as much as I hate the fact that he died and I hate the way he died, they gave us a lot of hope in the novelization by giving us that, or letting us know that he's still a Force ghost. He's still talking to Rey. He's still calling her my dear, my love, et cetera, et cetera. There's all these talks now about how there are rumors right now, and it always comes up every year, but there's rumors going around like, okay, since they were a dyad, is it possible for them to come back? I say yes.
I didn't
But
realize
yeah,
he
I
had. I
mean,
didn't realize he had so much dialogue as Ben Solo.
it's not in the movie. It's only in the novelization. I want to make that very clear, because the novelization was really, it was a bone that,
Yeah.
threw at all those Reylos. So yeah, in Star Wars, we have a different dynamic of this, afterlife, this idea of afterlife that exists only to Jedi, of course, but that does take something out of it. And so I think with like, the Bens and the Skywalkers and both Bens, Skywalkers, they're dead, but they're not really dead, and they get to kind of live on. So I don't know. So I want to make that clear, because we are going to talk about some examples where it was like, oh man, he died, but then like, oh well, not really dead. He's still here, and I see him in 2 movies later. So
Right.
before we get into all of that, I just quickly, were there any characters? And I have some. I have some examples of characters that are not Star Wars related that I always felt like are questionable deaths, and these are big characters. I'm not getting into. I was talking to somebody earlier, and they were like, "Oh, soap operas," and I'm like, "Yeah, wow. How many soap opera people die just on a daily basis, right? You
Right.
can't even keep those guys alive." I'm talking about like these major motion pictures where people kind of bite the bullet, and you really kind of scratch your head. But did you come up with any? Just, and we don't need to dive into them. I just want to kind of talk about them real quick.
Well, I think you had in a message you had sent me Tony Stark, right? Which I think is one of the maybe one of the
Avengers
more
Endgame.
from Avengers Endgame. I think one of the more hotly contested ones, because it was within the context of Thanos, you had everybody massed, half of everyone died, and so then you
Right.
had to come back and have one person sacrifice everything. And I think situations like that, I think, prove the case, though, that if you don't have anybody die, especially someone that means something to you and someone who's been with the franchise for so long, then it
Mhm.
just feels like you didn't have enough skin in the game. It just feels like you wished it all away in a comic book ending, even though comic books have people die and come back all the time, and it
Right.
doesn't. Usually, those deaths make room for something else. And so I think about a lot of those types of things within comic books in particular, where no death is permanent, to where you kill off a character, like, oh, we'll just wait till the next issue. Someone will fill the shoes. Captain America is a great example, right?
Yeah.
And then it ends up coming back, and it was somebody else for a while, and then then we get the main character again. So, but I mean, there's a lot of examples like that throughout a lot of different movies. I mean, the thing that always gets me is villains usually. Like, why do villains always have to die? Like, the one thing I liked about Bill, was it Batman? Oh gosh, the one with Heath Ledger. Heath Ledger is the Joker.
The Joker?
Yeah, because the Joker didn't die in that one, right?
No.
Is there-
I mean, it was kind of presumed, or yeah, he was still quote alive, I guess.
yeah, I mean, so that's the
I mean, he fell, but
no. He fell,
you
but
never know.
he caught him. I thought. I mean, Jack Nicholson's Joker clearly fell to his death and died, right? But I think that version of the Joker, I believe, survived. And so, to me, when you have those kind of mental games that can go on, even though we've beaten the character, we've defeated evil, we've moved on. There's been loss and difficulty. That they're still there in the background doesn't feel like we cheated anything by having that finality of death. And I think that's
Mm.
something with movies in general. We have to have this finality of death in order to feel like we had full resolution. And this is with the villains specifically. And I just find that really disappointing because I like villains that can come back and continue to be a threat or continue to be a psychological threat over time.
Yeah.
And so I think now TV shows tend to go the other route of that, and they kind of go the other extreme where they're always around and they just keep coming back and they somehow, and then it becomes silly. But in general, it's the villains that always get to me. It's not necessarily the heroes. Usually heroes die, and it's a kind of a great moment of why they died. And, you might be sad, but you can usually kind of make sense of it. But the villains for me
Hmm.
is always the one that kind of stick in my craw. Because we're going to run out of villains at some point in some of these franchises, at least the ones that mean anything.
Yeah. I mean, that falls probably more in line with just, good conquering evil. They have to kind of tell the good story.
Right. I mean, it's that everybody wants that finality, right, and that ultimate resolution. But how that's equated to death, for villains in the last 20, 25 years of movies, like of comic book adaptations and things like that, is just
Right.
really it's kind of, I don't know if it surprises me, but it's a little bit disappointing. It just wears a little bit thin. A character like Mysterio in the Spider-Man movies. Yeah, I know we're
Yeah.
well outside of Star Wars now, but I mean, like Mysterio was a character that was interesting enough, but for him to die, that one I was like, why? Like, just why? I mean, that one didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. So,
Well, so I'm going to run through these, and I don't know if you want to chime in or anybody in the chat wants to chime in on some of these and whether or not they felt like it was a good death or a bad death or you're still scratching your head. And I don't have very many, but Tony Stark was the one that came up with Pietro Maximoff from Avengers: Age of Ultron. Like they kill him off, and then now they're trying to bring him back, and there's a whole multiverse thing, right? And we get
so
all
I think that
that.
was a good death because it meant something for the Scarlet Witch. It meant something for Wanda Maximoff,
Yeah.
right? And that bond between siblings and direction that they went. It's I
And
thought
she was on her own. She had to figure out things on her own now, right?
exactly,
Become her own person kind
and
of
it
thing.
was something that stayed with her even through the through the TV series after that too.
Gwen Stacy, the Amazing Spider-Man #2 from 2014.
You mean Peter Parker's One True Love after Black
Yeah,
Cat?
after Black Cat. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Mary Jane Watson. You're not on the list.
Nope.
But,
Alicia Hardy all day.
yeah, any reason you feel like that one was a justified death?
I mean, yeah, I think it was really.
'Cause I
I
don't.
think that was an emotional death for. I think it was a super emotional death for Peter Parker. I mean, extremely important death for Peter Parker because again, it was something that the first time he had done the right thing, he had saved her. She was thrown off a bridge for those who don't know by the Green Goblin, and he caught her with his web, but in the process, it snapped her neck.
Yeah.
And so it was just that he felt personally responsible, even though he did all the things he probably thinks he could. It still came up short. It was really, and I think at that time, back when the comic was released, I mean, this was like 50 years ago, right? So, I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Right. We'll get in again, we'll get into the why. For me, this one didn't feel like it was really necessary or worthy, but the reason is because we never got to see the payoff of it, at least in the movies, right? I'm talking about Amazing Spider-Man 2. We never got part 3, so we
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know what that really kinda did to him, It we kinda got a sense of it later on, but that's an important factor in all this. Okay, so, this one now, I'm showing my age here, but Top Gun, Goose dying in Top Gun, which I actually enjoyed. Like, like, he was a main character, he died, it was shocking, but they did enough to kinda show that Maverick needed that, and later on, they even brought that back in the sequel, and
Right.
so I think they did a pretty good job with that, although it was kind of shocking at first. Okay, here's an example that I hate, and, Jeremy's not here. Jeremy from Transmissions Podcast, he's gonna totally agree with me and probably could
Oh,
do a two-hour
Optimus
show on
Prime.
this, but the death of Optimus Prime back in 1986 in the, Transformers the movie was so controversial
Yeah.
because it just came out of nowhere, and at the end of the
Oh, dude,
day,
it's the
he
death
was
of everybody that we grew
well,
up with in
yes.
Gen 1 in the
Yeah, there was a
movie.
lot of right.
Mm.
And so this is one of those why do characters die in movies and television comics? And this was
And the answer is
purely
two
to make
words:
money,
action figures.
to make more money. That's all that was. And as a kid, 13-year-old boy, I was like completely devastated for as many of us were for a number of years. And then they brought him back and he was evil and that made even people more pissed off. And they brought him back a second time and then finally he stayed and that was just a lot of it was response to fan criticism because like How do you kill Optimus Prime, right? He was
Right.
our hero. For a lot of us, he was our father figure. I don't want to get too deep into that. Okay, so here's a fun one, and this is the last one I have. A more recent relevant example, but Stranger Things has is notorious for killing off characters that we love, and I will name Barb, who okay, so Barb really wasn't that loved, but a lot of people did like her, and she did kind of shockingly die in season 1. But in season 2, we lost Bob, who was the love interest, and that was, like, just devastating on all levels to watch, not only him dying because it was completely shocking, but then the way he died and seeing it firsthand was really shocking. And then the last one, and Risk is already bringing up, is Eddie. Like, and Eddie's death is so controversial too, I think, because I felt for anybody that's watched Stranger Things, like, I really wanted him to live, and I don't know, that it was the right decision. Hopefully, he gets his death is redeemed, or I guess in some way, or they kinda show us why that really meant a lot. Maybe for, like, Dustin, we'll see some kind of impact there. I think we saw some immediate impact, but it just wasn't enough for me to, like, really go, "Oh, yeah, that made total sense." Like, no, why did you kill one of the greatest characters I think that they've ever written? So, see, Bob was not okay. Laura knows. So anyways, those are some examples. Now, so getting into the why characters die. So we've talked about money, right? That's one of these things. With actors and characters, sometimes I think this is what we're seeing a lot in Marvel. They're just getting up to a certain age, and you've got to figure out a way. How do we get rid of them, like, and still keep things going? And they've done a pretty good job of saying, okay, well, yeah, Tony Stark died, made a lot of people upset, made a lot of people cry in the theaters, and it was very emotional when it all happened. But at the same time, we realistically, he's kind of coming up on a point in his career, not only just age wise, but I don't know how much he wanted to continue doing that. And so it is a chance for rebirth. It is a chance to bring in new blood and retell these stories with different characters, different faces. They're kind of mirroring what they've been doing now for 5, 6 years, at least in the comic, if not more, in the comic books, right? Bringing in new characters that are kind of like the new Iron Man and all that. So I get that. That's one reason. Sometimes contracts, like, people just their contracts end, or there's, like, disagreements. Okay, so Cara Dune, right? I mean, she's gone, and we're not gonna see her again in The Mandalorian. But, did her character die? No, not in the literal sense on screen or off screen. Well, we don't know that for sure just yet, but she's not coming back, right? And so for me, it is a death, but that has nothing to do with anything outside of just, you know, politics and contracts and, you know, whatever was going on with her, in that regard.
Right, but I think it also shows you, like, and Cara Dune's a good example that you don't necessarily have to kill off a character to just move on from the character. Now, with some characters like a Tony Stark who have been so front, they are the face of your franchise in so many different ways that you feel like you have to do something with them. Relegating them to a cameo or something like that might not feel right. But there's a part of me that's like, that's okay to, if you don't want to kill
Yeah,
them off, you don't necessarily have to, just because of contractual reasons or whatnot.
yeah.
And so it's a little
Ride 'em off into the
disappointing.
sunset.
Yeah, but and that kind of goes to my point one. The character's no longer useful. The characters, you've seen everything the character had. This is Han Solo in a nutshell, right? You've seen everything the character has to offer. So what else can the character possibly offer you that makes them compelling to continue to see on screen and to develop the story? Right. I think that was Harrison Ford's idea with Han Solo during the original trilogy. And so as we get to the sequel trilogy, when with Force Awakens, did that still apply? Was that still true? Did he have really nothing much left to offer from a Han Solo developmental aspect of it, from an actor's perspective, Harrison Ford, but also from a story aspect? I
Mhm.
think those are a couple of that's probably the more hotly contested one, I guess, within Star Wars, because it's one of the more recent ones, that really,
Yeah.
of killing our main character, aside from Luke Skywalker, of course, that has a question mark next to it. But yeah, it kind of goes back to what else would you do with the character from a writer's
Mhm.
perspective or development or an actor? Sometimes you
Yeah.
just feel like you've reached that limit and you're just kind of done. I've done this for 20 years now, or 8 years, or 8 movies, or 9 movies. What else could
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
possibly do? No.
Right, or sometimes a story grows beyond them or grows too far away from them where they no longer become relevant, and so it's like,
Exactly.
what's my point here, right? Unless you're just gonna throw wads of cash at me. And I do have some we are gonna talk about Harrison Ford specifically. I have it listed as the Harrison Ford factor because it is something that has come up time and time again over the years, specifically to Star Wars, but somewhat related, and I wanna be very cautious about the way I talk about this, but another reason is just the death of the actors, and Carrie Fisher is a prime example of that, right?
I mean, sometimes your hand is forced in some ways. Yeah.
Exactly. And they had a really that was a really tough. I mean, it was tough for all of us to really kind of go through that, right? Emotionally, physically. But then the writers are just challenged with like, how do we send the character off and pay the respects to the character in a way that seems, I guess, just respectful, right?
Yeah,
It's
exactly. But again, it wasn't
and you're
really
not going to
the
make everybody happy either.
right. But it wasn't necessarily the crux of the debate of what Kasdan and Lucas were having, though, either. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's another, I guess, valid reason as to why a character would die, and that's just somebody's not there. This is all going to be interesting. We've talked about this before too, but this all becomes a very interesting topic to talk about further as we get better and better with like, you know, technology and being able to take a character's face and make it, de-age it and do all the wonderful things that they're doing
Yeah,
now.
the speech
I don't
stuff
know.
now. You got a lot of
Yeah,
options. Yeah.
a lot of great stuff that
I mean, they've
they
recast a bunch of
developed.
roles like Dumbledore in the Harry Potter series too, right? And that character had a lot more, had a lot more story to go to, so they had to recast it. And
Yep, no,
it's
that's
a
good.
challenge. It doesn't always work. In that case, it worked out pretty well.
Hmm. We'll get into there's an example in Star Wars, and I don't want to spoil it because we're going to talk about it, but there's an example in Star Wars where they killed a character off because they just didn't have enough money to spend any more on the budget to develop it any further. And that actor or actress is very upset. And I've got some quotes from her in terms of what had happened. So
Must be
not to
Maz
spoil that, but
Must be Maz Kanata.
there will be a celebration happening here at the.
We promise we're getting to everyone. We're 36 minutes into the show, and we've still not really talked about any of it.
Okay, let's start. So let's do that. Let's talk about. I want to talk about Lawrence Kasdan because I just want to make sure that people understand who he is. Because Lawrence Kasdan, for a number of accounts, and I think a lot of people would agree, George Lucas is the person that created Han Solo. He created that character, and we got a flavor of him in A New Hope, which was completely Lucas. But I think what, for me at least, where his character really came and developed and shined, he had just so much more personality. And a lot of it is, I don't want to take anything from Harrison Ford because Harrison Ford had a lot to do with it as well. But this is Lawrence Kasdan's character, right? Lawrence Kasdan was brought on during Empire Strikes Back to breathe life into these characters in a way that we hadn't gotten in A New Hope, to develop those characters, allow them to grow. And he is so connected to Harrison Ford. And this is and you were talking about this earlier, not to jump ahead, but the reason why Lawrence Kasdan came back, because he was done. Like after Return of the Jedi, he was already done. He and Lucas worked well together. I think Lucas liked working with him. I don't know that Larry really enjoyed. I mean, I'm sure they did, but they did go at it quite a bit on just differing ideas and opinions about how things should happen. But he was kind of done with Star Wars. He walked away at the end of Return of the Jedi, never really wanted to come back. And they went so far as to like, they invited him to come on to be a co-writer for Force Awakens. He turned it down immediately. There's a story in there where they sent a messenger, like literally sent somebody on foot with the script to his house so that he could just, you don't even have to go anywhere. We'll bring the script to you. We just want you to go through and make edits and kind of give us your feedback. He turned that down. And then it wasn't until a phone call was made, and I forget, it might have been Kathleen Kennedy or Bob Iger or somebody reached out and said, this is really going to be a Han Solo story. And it was that moment that he said, I was all in. Like they finally said the magic words. I didn't care about Star Wars, but I cared enough about Han Solo that I wanted to be able to contribute and, send his character off in a way that I felt was ceremoniously and all of that. So,
I mean, this is the whole reason why John and Larry did Solo, a Star Wars story as well.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. His sons were involved in that later on. And to be so other things for anybody that doesn't know, he was a co-writer of Return of the Jedi, The Force Awakens, Solo, as you mentioned, co-writer for Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is where George Lucas and he first met. Lucas kind of gave him carte blanche to really do this, and even though he had never even read the script, the notes that Larry had done on Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was a very interesting story as well. He directed two movies, The Big Chill and The Accidental Tourist, that were Oscar nominations for Best Picture. He really spoke highly of George Lucas. He felt that George Lucas and he did have agreements. He says George is one of the good guys. He and I have some disagreements. George thinks if you play the commercial movie game, a very expensive game, you have to play for big stakes. And so, a very good writer. He had some bad directing movies too. I don't want to say he didn't have a rosy kind of resume,
Right.
but he was he's a valid dude. Like he's certainly somebody that you want Lucas respected his opinion, and I think it's worth to talk about here when we're talking about their viewpoints.
Right. I think if you're to go read the exchange, between Lucas and Kasdan, it really is very much a really good creative working relationship. A lot of great ideas. I feel bad because Richard Marquand is also in these conversations that were transcripted or transcribed. And he's just nodding his head basically the whole time. Yeah, I like that idea. That's fun. I mean, yeah, I just feel bad that why did you should have just ignored all of those when you transcribed this and just left it between Lucas and Kasdan, because it was clear they were the decision makers. They were the creative, they were the creative power behind the movie, getting it made, getting the ideas on paper, and then Lawrence Kasdan, of course, going out there and actually putting meat to the characters, putting meat to the story in the actual writing aspect of it, rather than the creative direction that George was setting for him. And so, but when you read these transcriptions, though, it's a really great peek into that debate, or just a debate in general, of just the creative process that goes between in a writer's room or things like that, because it's just you don't always have an appreciation that someone's just not. It wasn't like George did with A New Hope, where he just sat there and locked himself in a room, or with Empire and just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. This is very much giving a guidance and giving here's the direction we're heading. Here's some general themes. Go figure out what that story actually looks like. And then come back and we debate it as we go. It's a lot of fun to see that process kind of in motion.
Let's talk about their viewpoints, because this is really kind of the crux of this whole episode, really. So I think for Kasdan, we don't get a whole lot.
Hey everyone, it's Jonesy. We hope you've enjoyed this preview of the Patreon episode. If you'd like to listen to the episode in full, we invite you to head over to cantinacast.com/Patreon. Access to this episode begins at the $2 After Dark tier. If you're interested in joining a future Patreon episode, we encourage you to check out our Now Part of the Tribe and Delusions of Grandeur tiers. You can find all the details at cantinacast.com/Patreon. On behalf of Albert and myself, thank you all for your continued support, and may the Force be with you.